estimation, that is venous blood and Coulter counter estimation, to determine the hemoglobin levels amongst the children. He mentioned he used more rigorous selection criteria than WHO to determine the percentiles. And he also said that the results were not unexpectedly lower than the WHO reference using the same methodology. So this, he believes, is the advantage of his paper, that he has used better selection criteria and he has used state-of-the-art methods of hemoglobin estimation. He also gave me a little note at the end of the email that these were merely statistical cutoffs and that the next step would be to try and define physiological cutoffs that are associated with functional outcomes like work capacity, low cardiac output, etc. So this is my report as private investigator, and I'd like to hand over to Parth to delve deeper into the paper.
Thank you, Disha. Now, Parth will discuss about the study in details.
Thanks, Veena. I hope my slides are visible.
Yeah.
So, first of all, thank you for joining on a Friday, that too on a festive season. Clearly, this is an amazing cohort of nerds, and somehow ASAR has managed to get all of you guys. This paper came out in 2021, and what if in one slide, if I were to summarize what they are trying to say, is that the authors argue that WHO's anemia cutoff is not valid for India. Based on the survey, the cutoff should be 1 to 2 gram lower. And ultimately, when we do this, the prevalence of anemia would reduce and it would be more in line with the efforts that India has made over the past few decades. Now, you might be wondering why 2021 paper in 2023? What is the reason we chose this specific paper for this journal club? Why not something else? So I'll take you over the past few years what has happened in the country. In 2015-16, we had the NFHS 4 data come out, which reported that our anemia prevalence in almost all categories, age groups, had dropped compared to NFHS 3. So over the past 10 years, we had significantly reduced anemia in the country. But it was still a cause of severe public health concern because the prevalence of anemia was still more than 40%. So despite good efforts, still a cause of major concern. So in 2018, the government of India launched its flagship program called the Anemia Mukt Bharat. The aim of this program was to decrease anemia prevalence by 3% every year and then ultimately make India anemia mukt. But what happened in 2019-21? We had our next NFHS data come out. And that showed that the progress that we had made in NFHS 4 compared to NFHS 3, we had lost all of it. Anemia prevalence had worsened in all categories, not just by a few percentages, but quite significantly. So if you look at the map of India, we look at distribution of anemia. The red part shows that it's a huge problem there. And on the right side of the screen, if you see, the red highlights places, orange and red highlight places which have worsened with worsened prevalence of anemia compared to NFHS 4 and 5. So the picture wasn't looking really good. And this was obviously the paper which came out next, which showed that anemia cutoff in India should be dropped and it will result in a drop in prevalence. And because anemia was worsening in the country, obviously it was picked up by our media and a lot of news articles came out criticizing the government, saying anemia's approach has been wrong and the country is facing a huge burden of anemia. So when this paper came out, finally in 2023, the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, two of them who are technically economists by training, wrote a public health article saying that, this paper they picked up from 2 years ago and now started advocating that we should drop our anemia prevalence because the government was being scrutinized a lot. And this is exactly the reason why in 2023, a paper which was done in 2021 is of extreme relevance. Moving on to the article. Most importantly, nobody has funded them. So at least that bias is off the window. No funding received as such for this specific paper. In the paper, they mentioned that the Indian Ministry of Health and Family Welfare owns the CNNS data, and you can get the data set if you send an email to the one of the authors, Dr. Rajiv Acharya. And I'll come to this later, why I have specifically mentioned this. Now, coming back to the introduction of the paper, this is what they mention in the paper, and Madhurima again will be breaking this down in the next presentation. They mention that existing WHO cutoffs to define anemia are too old. They are from 1968, and the population in that study was predominantly a white adult population. And so Indians were missed, which is why it can't be valid for India. Also, at that time, data for various age groups was not there. So infants, young children, adolescents, older people. So these, again, this population cannot follow the same cutoff. They quote a study from 2019, and they say that a review of 60 global studies found that anemia cutoffs are actually lower for infants, young children, menopausal women, older people, and higher for men. So there was data present available which showed that all cutoffs are not similar to what WHO had said. Another study which they cited, they mentioned that in Africans and Asian region, anemia cutoff was significantly lower, 1 to 2 gram. However, limited conclusions can be made regarding normal reference because only few studies had specifically excluded individuals with iron deficiency, anemia, or inflammation. This is what the lacunae of knowledge was there till the study was done, that a stringent criteria had not been followed till now to evaluate normal hemoglobin level. Lastly, they mentioned, like even Disha mentioned, they mentioned in their paper that although anemia is defined functionally, its diagnosis in this paper is purely statistical. However, what would be ideal would be to have a functional definition, not a statistical definition. Coming to their objective of this paper was to assess the age-specific and sex-specific percentiles for hemoglobin cutoff in children and adolescents aged 1 to 19. So even though CNNS had 0 to 19 population, because blood samples are not taken for 0 to 1 year age group, they excluded them from this study. And they used the Comprehensive National Nutritional Survey, which I'll talk about in a few slides. So the methodology they used was, CNNS was designed before 2016. It was carried out in 2016 to 18. And the purpose of CNNS was to provide a nationally representative data on the nutritional status of children and adolescents. The objectives of this survey, it's very important to note that the 3 main objectives were to assess the extent severity of micronutrient deficiency, risk factor for non-communicable disease, and prevalence of dual burden of malnutrition, which is stunting wasting, using anthropometric measures. So the main objective of this paper was not to find out the normal cutoff for anemia. These 3 were the primary objectives, and the sample size which was calculated for CNNS survey was based on these objectives. So it's very important to note that the sample size was not calculated, keeping in mind that normal HP value has to be reported in the CNNS survey. The methodology of this specific paper, so what the authors did was they used the data available from CNNS. They selected one primary sample using a lot of exclusion criteria, and they've used added more exclusion criteria and selected 4 additional analytical samples. To say that if we have multiple groups and all of them report the same hemoglobin cutoff, that is most likely to be the ideal or the true hemoglobin cutoff. So this is basically what they did. They had a huge sampling frame. They applied a lot of exclusion criteria and reached one sample, which is the analytical sample 1. And then they added exclusion criteria to analytical sample 1 and made 4 more samples. So they had nearly 67,000 people to begin with. They found that nearly 50,000 people had blood reports with them, and around 40,000 had a hemoglobin value. So out of those people, they applied 2 exclusion cutoffs. One was, if they have in the first group, if they had any missing values, they just chucked them. So ultimately, 19,000 people had in the first group missing values. So they were excluded. 21,000 were included. Out of those 21,000, if there was any abnormality in these specific investigations, they were excluded again. So they were ultimately left with 8,000 people in analytical sample 1, 6,000 people in analytical sample 2. So they said that because they have excluded nutritional causes, inflammatory causes, they have ruled out a majority of the causes of anemia. So ultimately, whatever are the remaining people, they are healthy and their HB value will be the normal HB value. So this is what they have tried to do. And to be honest, these exclusion criteria are extremely stringent. For example, in this, they have looked at HbA1c in kids as well. So if there is any signal that they have some glycemic abnormality, they have been excluded. Cholesterol, creatinine, so all chronic diseases they have looked after. So the exclusion criteria has been extremely stringent. In the analytical sample 1 and 2, they have further added exclusion criteria like low serum albumin, any history of parasitic infection, or zinc deficiency. And then they have made even further, they have made 3 more analytical samples. So now they are left with these 5 samples in which they have tried to calculate the HP value of these people because they're assuming that all of these are normal. Or at least one of them will be normal. So that's what they're trying to say. These are the cutoffs they have used. But the interesting part here is that so far the argument has been that India needs its own cutoff. But the cutoffs they have used are again based on all foreign populations. None of these cutoffs, Kim et al., Williamson et al., all the cutoffs they have used for their exclusion criteria are based on foreign population. So if this is reliable, then why not HB is one thing that I thought of. And what they have done after that is they have calculated the hemoglobin cutoff in all the 5 populations. And they have said that if we calculate the 95% confidence interval, the range in which that hemoglobin lies, and if this range is overlapping in all the 5 samples, that means their samples they're fitting well. So each sample is comparable. That's what they're trying to say. So if sample 1 has, for example, so what they have done is, for example, for boys, they have calculated the HB cutoff, which is shown by the dark line, the HB values at different age group. So the solid line shows that, and the shaded part shows the 95% confidence interval. So they are saying if this 95% confidence interval overlaps, that means that the populations are quite similar. And they found that for both boys and girls, the 95% confidence interval was overlapping, which is why they have chucked all the other 4 analytical samples, saying that they have statistically proven that all these 5 samples are quite similar, which is why they have worked only on analytical sample 1 after this part. This is again the same thing which they have tried to do. So what they have done for the statistical analysis, they have found out the differences in the socio-demographic parameters between the entire sample and the analytical sample they have taken. So how different is the sample that they have chosen from the original sample of CNNS? Is it similar to that? Because the original sample was representative sample of the country. So is this sample that has been formed after a lot of exclusion criteria, is this as similar as the sample which was originally there for CNNS? And interesting to note is that it wasn't similar. There were a lot of differences. Age was different in the sample. Hemoglobin was obviously different because it was expected to be higher in this population. Anthropometric measures were different. Place of residence was different. More people were there from the urban areas in their analytical sample. More people were there from East and Northeast area. More Muslims were there compared to the original sample. And more people from the richest wealth index were there compared to the original CNS sample. So this sample which they have taken finally for analysis is not very similar to the CNNS ka original sample, which again questions the representativeness of this sample. How representative is the analytical sample of the country, of anybody in the country? After that, what they have done is they have laid down all the values and they have taken the 5th percentile. And the reason is that they are saying if 95% of the people have a hemoglobin value above that cutoff, then they are assuming it to be the normal cutoff. Because in normal people, if 2 standard deviation, which is roughly 95%, if they lie in that cutoff range, then that value should be normal hemoglobin and others can be outliers. And then these cutoffs were compared with WHO's cutoffs, and the authors estimated age-specific, sex-specific anemia prevalence using these cutoffs, and finally reported the change in anemia prevalence. So what happened in the results is that because they had used such a stringent exclusion criteria, it resulted in nearly 80% loss of data from the original sample. So what started at around 60,000 was left at around 8,000. The primary analytical sample included participants predominantly from Hindu religion. This was just their socio-demographic characteristic of the final sample. However, if we compare this sample from the original CNNS sample, higher percentage of Muslims were there in this analytical sample. And again, I've mentioned Eastern, Northeastern differences. A very interesting thing which they have mentioned is that, and this is quote unquote from their paper, children in the primary sample were undersized compared with WHO standards, which means ranging from minus 0.8 z-score to minus 1.2 z-score for various anthropometric indices. What this means is they were 1.2 to 0.8 standard deviation below the WHO cutoff. So these kids were smaller compared to what WHO defines as normal. So in a way to say that they were more malnourished, acute, chronic, both. So if you guys have read the paper and seen the supplementary file, you'll see that height for age, weight for age, weight for height, all of them are significantly lesser in this analytical sample compared to WHO standards. And again, they had 2/3 of the participants were from richest wealth quintiles, again, which doesn't really represent how our distribution of wealth quintiles in India is, and more rural than urban, which is how India is. So this is what they have finally found, that when the red line shows the HB level that they found, which is a 5th percentile cutoff. And the blue line is what WHO advises the cutoff to be. And because the shaded part here is again the 95% confidence interval, and they are saying because the 95% interval is confidence interval is not overlapping with WHO's cutoff, that means something is different. Even the 95%, the lowest margin of 95% confidence interval is nowhere close to WHO's cutoff, which means there's something different happening in India. And based on this, then they have suggested, and this is happening for both boys and girls. And so they have reached the conclusion that our cutoff should definitely be lower, because WHO's cutoff is not lying even in the lowest cutoff of 95% confidence interval of our normal HB value. So they reported that for boys, the difference between the study and WHO cutoff was ranging approximately from 1 to 2. And similarly for girls, it was ranging from around 0.8 to 1.5. And overall, if we use the new cutoff that this study found, if we reassess the prevalence of anemia, the overall weighted anemia prevalence would drop to 19.2%, lower than what the WHO would have, cutoff would have given. So almost by 20% anemia prevalence has dropped based on their cutoffs. And it has dropped for all age groups, like mentioned here. So 25% in 1 to 4 age group, 15% in 5 to 14, and again around 20% in 15 to 19. So all age groups noticed a drop in anemia prevalence with the newer cutoffs. The limitations that the authors have reported is that stringent exclusion criteria, like I mentioned, resulted in a lot of loss of sample. The authors say they could not evaluate a few other blood investigations like thiamine, pyridoxine, copper, but they say that this is quite rare in public health setting, and they are unlikely to affect the findings. And iron stores could not be evaluated in detail because the data was not collected. Again, a drawback of doing a secondary data analysis. Another limitation they have reported is that the survey design precluded the inclusion of infants. So they don't know what the normal cutoff is for infants because they didn't have the blood samples for infants. And even though exposure to infection in the preceding 2 weeks was an exclusion criteria, they could have some infection, chronic infection, which could have affected their erythropoiesis, which could not be ruled out. So again, this was one of the limitations that the authors cited. Now coming to my critical review of what happened in this paper. So I have a few questions to ask. So first concern in the study is that was the purpose of the study really to estimate hemoglobin cutoff? It wasn't. The purpose of the study was to, like I mentioned, the three objectives: malnutrition, micronutrient deficiency, and risk factor for NCD. So the study was not powered, the sample size was not calculated to estimate the cutoff. So relying on this result becomes difficult because the primary intention with which the study was designed was not this. So ideally, if so you can only prove the primary objective if your sample size has been calculated based on your primary objective. So if an objective is not there in your primary objectives, you can't statistically say that what you have found is close to the reality, close to the truth. My second question is that was the analytical sample representative of the Indian population? Again, it wasn't. And this was again out of control of the researchers. But this sample had, like I mentioned, more people from urban areas, more people compared to Indian scenario, more people from Northeast, more Muslims. So again, it's not entirely representative of how India is. The third and the most critical one is that can an undernourished population be considered as normal? So could they have excluded kids who were stunted, malnourished, wasted, and then looked at the HP cutoff? So that's one query that I have. Something which they've already mentioned, should the exclusion criteria also include functional symptoms of anemia? So if somebody is coming who has completely perfect biophysical profile, height, weight, normal, biochemistry, everything is normal, but they are having some fatigue, they are having clinical examination, they have pallor, or there's something is going on with them which clinically you feel they have anemia, either they're giving some sign or they have some symptom of anemia, should they also have been excluded? But again, this was not possible in this specific study because there was no contact with the people who were involved in the study, and this was just a secondary data analysis. And my last question is the method used in this study the best way to estimate hemoglobin cutoff? Now, there are other methods also to estimate cutoffs. The other most famous one being ROC, receiver operating curve, which if you guys read up about how diabetes cutoff was estimated, why is 140 a cutoff, why is 126 a cutoff, why is 100 a cutoff? So these cutoffs, how did they reach these cutoffs? So they use the ROC method on that cutoff, because again, just like anemia, pre-diabetes or new onset diabetes is asymptomatic, just like mild anemia is asymptomatic. So could they have, so what method is used there is that they'll follow people with HP levels and they look for complication, and there they look for neurological complication. And they said people who have neurological complication, what is their fasting blood glucose, not fasting, their postprandial blood glucose like. People who don't have complications, what is their postprandial glucose like? And then they reach the postprandial cutoff. And using the postprandial cutoff, they reach the fasting cutoff. Could something like that be used for anemia? Follow up people, look for complications of anemia, and then estimate the cutoff. The only difficult part is that complications of anemia are not as specific as diabetes. So again, how this could be done, I'm not sure. This is a question that is I'm putting for discussion. Another concern in the study is if you look at the CNNS report, the survey highlights a lot of alarmingly low good feeding practices. So only 58% of the children in that study received exclusive breastfeeding, 42% receive minimum food, the minimum number of times a day, only 21% have adequate dietary diversity, and only 6% receive minimum acceptable diet. So if all this is involved, again, if the nutrition is so compromised, can those children can we expect them to have a normal HP cutoff? Moving on to the stroke checklist, I'll just talk about the things which I feel were problematic. For example, in background and rationale, this I think Madhurima will highlight, but some of the papers that they have cited, they have misinterpreted those papers in the introduction. In the variables, ideally, they were supposed to mention potential confounders. In their results, they have mentioned that children are malnourished, smaller than the WHO cutoff, but they have not brought this out as a limitation. So that's something that they should have done. They have not statistically shown that the number of study subjects in this study were how much they should have been for statistically interpreting the findings well. They have not explained that. Again, potential confounders have come in here. They have mentioned that in their results, but they have not sort of said it in an alarming way, is what I personally felt, which is why it's light green. They have done it, but they could have mentioned it better. These two are not applicable. Again, limitations, they have mentioned limitations of the study. Again, the same point, smaller kids should have been mentioned there. And ultimately, ideally, they are supposed to give a cautious overall interpretation, but their findings, the way they have reported, is that drop the cutoff because it's not matching our efforts over the years. And this is what is the right cutoff. So it's not a very cautious interpretation of the data, of the findings, and which is why it's being picked up now. And a lot of people want this to be reduced who are not obviously from the public health side. And generalizability, how generalizable are the findings? I'm extremely doubtful. So what are the implications of these findings? Ultimately, currently, if we see the scenario in the country, what's happening is anemia is no longer being measured. NFHS 6 has excluded HP estimation. NFHS has a sample size of around 7 to 8 lakhs, and it gives district level representative data. Now we are relying on a new survey, which is called DABS-I, which is Dietary and Biomarker Survey India. And we are saying that DABS-I will tell us about anemia. But the sample size of DABS-I is around 1.8 lakhs. It's extremely less, and it's only going to give us state level representative data. So we don't have district level data for anemia. We have only state level data from henceforth. And we have no idea when DABS-I will be completed. There is no date on completion of DABS-I, when the findings will be published. We don't know that. NFHS is currently ongoing. So at least we know that when the survey gets over and the next year the report comes out. DABS-I has been, they have been very secretive about DABS-I. The other problem, which is that CNNS report, even though it's there in the public domain, CNNS data set is not there in public domain. CNNS is again a publicly funded survey. Taxpayers pay for it. It's done by Government of India, UNICEF collaboration. If NFHS data can be there in the public domain for researchers to analyze, interpret, reinterpret, then why can't CNNS data be there? CNNS, even the questionnaires are not available in the public domain, which I feel is quite problematic with papers like these coming out. So ultimately, what are the implications of these findings? Now, I am sure a lot of you are healthcare professionals who have joined this call or from public health background. And these changes will have a serious impact on all populations. So maternal health will get compromised. There is enough evidence to show that less than 11 HP is associated with poorer maternal outcomes, stillbirth, preterm, higher chances of LSCS, enough and more data to tell us that 11 is what we should aim for in mothers. Child health is going to be compromised. We know anemia is associated with cognitive decline. We know anemia is associated with increased frequency of infection, malnutrition, a lot of things. So again, adult population health. Anemia is associated with moderate to severe anemia is associated with heart failure. It's associated with depression. Again, adults will also be affected. And finally, now with that India is aging, we're estimating by 2050, 20% of our population will be geriatric. So looking at that, geriatric health again is going to be compromised. Any poor wound healing, faster cognitive decline, again, everything is associated with anemia. And yeah, that's it. I'll stop here. I'll pass it on to Madhurima. If there are any doubts, please feel free to add to the chat box and I'll answer those questions there or at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Parth. This was really comprehensive critical review of the paper. Now I would like to call Madhurima uh, to elaborate possible follow-up projects. Sorry. to share the details about other studies inspired by the current studies. Thank you.
Thank you
Do
so
you?
much, Dr. Reena. Thank you. Thank you, Parth, also for sharing such an insightful presentation. And thank you all for joining this session today. And also thank you to my previous speaker, Disha Agrawal, for also explaining. And it is actually one of the most interesting journal clubs that I've been a part of because it has a lot of interesting roles. And today, the role that I'm going to be playing is that of an archaeologist, where we will be looking at the articles which are cited by the study, which is under discussion, that is hemoglobin thresholds to define anemia in a national sample of healthy children and adolescents aged 1 to 19 years in India, which is a population-based study. It is a secondary data analysis, which we'll be looking at. And we'll also look at the articles which are citing this study as an inspiration for their own purposes. So this article was published in 2021, and Parth has already gone over why it is important to be under discussion right now. And I would like to add one important point that personally, when I go through data for not just anemia, for I'm primarily involved with mental health research in ASAR, and whenever we go through data based on alcohol based, like any data based on substance use or suicide prevention, like we do not find representative samples at all. So I feel it is very important for us as researchers to find like whatever data that we have. Like we have a population of 1.78 billion, so I think the best we can do is NFHS, which has a sample of 700,000. So like interpreting it very critically and very carefully is very important for us to define what goes out to the public and to the researchers. So on that note, I would like to begin. So this first we look at the articles which have been cited by the study. There are a total of 39 articles which have been referenced. It is a secondary data analysis, and it uses the primary level data which was collected by CNSS, which is CNNS, which is Comprehensive National Nutritional Survey of 2019. And it is available publicly, and as Parth covered, it is the data set is not available. The only like the procedures of it is available, and you can request it for the data set is what it says. Now, there are a bunch of articles in the study which have been referenced, which point to this narrative that there is a lot of evidence that suggests that WHO is rethinking the existing thresholds. And WHO wants the thresholds to be more country specific, and like it should be doing like updating the guidelines which already exist for hemoglobin values for evaluating anemia, which partly is true, but how it is being interpreted is actually far from the truth. So these are the three articles which have been heavily referenced throughout the article again and again. So the first one we'll be looking at, which is hemoglobin concentration for the diagnosis of anemia and the assessment of its severity. This guideline is an updated version of the first like guideline which came out for hemoglobin assessment in 1968. So in the introduction, it heavily speaks about how they want to refute the guidelines given in 1968 and like how it is predominantly based on European population, not representative of the Indian sample. But yeah, again, that is far from the truth because we do have an updated guideline, which just get to the next slide. Yeah, so we do have an updated guideline, which was released in 2011. And this guideline specifically says that the consultation was called, like this particular report was prepared and the consultation was called after the start of a worldwide multi-country collaborative study, which included India. And India had the largest sample size. It included Vellore and Delhi. And it had the largest sample size representative of the Indian population for making this updated version of the guideline. So yeah, it investigated iron metabolism in pregnancy, as well as the role of hookworm in anemia during pregnancy, and tested the procedures for examining blood and serum. So again, like what they're referencing is that they want to refute the 1968 guidelines, which was based on white populations, but it has been updated since, and they do not really speak about this. The second article that we're looking at is, yeah, like we mentioned, that they do point out to the evidence that WHO is rethinking hemoglobin threshold, which in part is true, that they are revisiting WHO hemoglobin thresholds to define anemia in clinical medicine as well as in public health. But what does this commentary that they have cited exactly say is that WHO is reviewing the use and interpretation of hemoglobin thresholds for assessing iron status in individuals and populations, but they are going to review this by a procedural work or a normative work, which will follow guidelines and like evidence-based guideline development procedures, which they have already stated. Like there is a handbook of WHO, which has guidelines for updating the existing guidelines for anemia. And yeah, so this code, the second point, is actually verbatim from those guidelines, which says that if there is already some existing guidelines which exist for certain diseases, they will examine its quality and applicability and also like consider updating it given the requirement. So yeah, so they like this is the reference book of WHO's revisit commentary, which we saw just now, and this handbook, which is there for guideline development. This you can visit, and this is an excerpt from that guideline, which actually talks about why WHO should be the organization to produce this guideline. And does anemia fall within the scope of WHO's governing body is something that is like being challenged with this article. Next, we come to a group of studies which have been referenced from other countries in the study, which suggests that there should be lowering of cutoffs because in countries like Italy and like other globally conducted studies, they do see that there is a lowering of cutoffs as compared to the WHO guidelines, which again is only partly correct, because the first study which we look at, that is the variation of hemoglobin levels in the normal Italian populations from the genetic isolates. In this study, the findings do say that the lower hemoglobin limits in the Italian men are slightly higher than the corresponding values in whites and blacks, but the differences that they have observed should be confirmed on larger samples, because the sample was predominantly like, I think it was spanning only about a few thousand people. So that is not representative of Italy. Then the normal hemoglobin levels in the elderly cannot be taken to be conclusive, is what they have clearly stated in their findings. So it does say that it has to be confirmed. So yeah, so that's the first study that we look at in this evidence. The second one is the variation in hemoglobin across life cycle between males and females. This was published in 2019. And again, this study also says that the suggested cutoff for children in African and American and African children are all lower than the WHO recommendation. But it should be noted that while many of these studies excluded children with illnesses or inflammation, none of these studies excluded children with low iron status or reported iron status. So low reference ranges may be indicative of a higher prevalence in iron deficiency anemia. However, again, it is not very conclusive. It is just an indication that there should be a larger study that should be conducted with a larger sample size. Next, we come to the articles which are citing the study. This is a little problematic because, again, like we said, that data that is available should be criticized and scrutinized properly. Otherwise, it can lead to dangerous conclusions, like we'll see ahead. The thresholds which are suggested by the study have been discussed in defining prevalence in several regions. This includes like regions within India subnationally. It also includes in other countries like that of China and Bangladesh. Then surveys on a larger scale have been conducted. This, I think, is a positive takeaway that there is a survey on a larger scale which has been conducted, and it has discussed this article and the lowering of cutoff limits in this article. However, it does not base off a lot of it on this particular study. The third type of article that has cited this study are articles which have tried to understand the attempt of India's national programs in reducing the burden of anemia. And yeah, they think that if the burden is lowered, then obviously like if the cutoff for hemoglobin is lower, then we can find the true picture of anemia, which again is left to interpretation. So this study has been discussed for defining prevalence in subnational regions like Odisha in India, and also in several states through this study, that is anemia in Indians aged 10 to 19 years. So they have also tried to define the prevalence based on these parameters, but however, they don't do it, they just discuss it. They have used the WHO guidelines. Here also, they have discussed the findings of the study in the Chinese rural populations and in Nigeria, and also in Bangladesh, there was a study which discussed these findings. This is one of a kind study, which again talks about the way forward and says that the burden that is found to be worsening according to NFHS could be an overestimate, that the burden might actually be lower because of lowering low cutoff, and they actually advocate for lessening the iron supply, iron fortification of rice, which is made mandatory. So they say that there is no efficacy for iron supplementation, and moreover, there is no data on iron deficiency anemia being increasing in burden and worsening. So why fortify food with iron is what they're arguing here. Then we have this article, which I would like to conclude my presentation with. They draw 4 conclusions based on India's struggle to reduce the burden of anemia, and they talk about 4 different things. The first is that CNSS, which is Comprehensive National Nutrition Survey, they determined capillary blood sample. They have determined the venous blood samples, and national surveys, they predominantly use capillary blood samples to determine hemoglobin levels. So they argue, firstly, that nationally venous blood samples should be collected to determine hemoglobin levels, which is okay. And the second conclusion they have here is that, again, the food fortification programs, they could be harmful, and further research is required for fortifying food, and also for pharmacological intervention. So for example, Anemia Mukt Bharat does prescribe provision of iron tablets and syrup supplementations, which again they are questioning. The third takeaway from this article was that WHO is in the process of reviewing hemoglobin thresholds for defining anemia, and therefore introduction of anemia control programs should be restrained, and funding to those programs should be restrained, is what they go on saying in the further articles. So on that note, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Reena.
Thank you, Madhurima, for sharing such beautiful presentations and telling about the other studies that other studies inspired by the current studies. Now, I would like to call again Parth to describe us about to tell us about the possible follow projects as a result of current paper. Over to you, Parth.
Okay, so the way forward, and the reason I'm saying that what can we do to prevent this is prevent studies which come out like this with data source not accessible to independent researchers. What can we do when such papers come out? So the most important thing to do as researchers is to research and reanalyze the data. But is it possible in this scenario? It's possible, but extremely difficult. And the other option is to conduct independent research with the primary aim of estimating normal hemoglobin level in a healthy population. The best case scenario is you take the blood sample of everybody in the country and find out whoever is having iron deficiency, all those deficiencies, and then find out. But that obviously is not possible in a supposedly resource constrained country like ours. So what has to be done next is definitely not something like what has happened, removing anemia estimation from NFHS 6. So how do we tackle that? I'll come to that. But I had mentioned that accessibility to the data was mentioned in the paper, saying that you can email Dr. Rajeev Acharya, and I'm just sharing some screenshots of some attempts that we have made so far. We have mailed multiple times, but we haven't still heard back from the ministry. So we texted the author directed us to UNICEF. UNICEF said we can't give the data, contact ministry. We have written to the ministry a few times, nothing from the ministry. So what can we do next? First and foremost, write a letter to the editor. Now it's already 2 years since this paper came out, but I think we can still write something back to the editor saying that we don't have access to the primary data. There's no way to prove it, and there are these blocks that we see. The other way to advocate is do your own research, understand things well, and then write newspaper articles. And I see Sadesh has joined this call, and we had a long discussion on when to advocate. And I agree with him that the advocacy in this part was quite premature. This paper definitely follows a very stringent methodology, but it's not foolproof. And for that, we require the data. So our advocacy should focus on give us access to the data so we can understand it better, and then probably all of us can agree. And then other forms of advocacies. And lastly, move on to activism, which again happened quite prematurely in this scenario when this op-ed that I shared initially came out. There were open letters written, there were petitions written, but again, the argument that they had mentioned was not a very strong argument to bring any change. So first step has to be research. And ASAR as a research organization has been trying to get access to the data. Unfortunately, we have not succeeded so far. And then next should be your advocacy and plus minus activism. And that's my concluding slide. There are lies, damn lies, and statistics, and we are looking for somebody who can make all three of these work for us. And so these are, I would say, tricky times as public health researchers. So whatever data we have should be scrutinized well. And I think this journal club at ASAR is a great platform to do this. So yeah, thank you everybody for giving us your time and listening to us. And that's it. I'll hand it back to Reena. Thank you.
Thank you, Bart. Thank you so much. So thank you everyone for the detailed critical analysis of the current paper. Now I would like to emphasize on question answer round. If anyone has any doubt, kindly unmute them, unmute and share or get in the chat box.
Yeah, sure. So, brilliant presentation, everyone, and happy Diwali. This is festive season. But yeah, I did have one question. I wanted to challenge the legitimacy of the exclusion mechanism that was used during this. Which was used. I mean, for exclusion criteria, on one aspect, this whole research aims to establish that European findings for normal hemoglobin level is different from an Indian finding for normal hemoglobin level. Whereas when we are excluding the vitamin A deficiency, other microvitamins and other deficiencies, doing the exclusion criteria, we are using European or Western cutoffs. So if then I'm curious why only hemoglobin level is different for Indian and Western population. And if you really think that if there's some physiological deficiency, some physiological deficit which is normal for Indian population, then why is it not established for other markers of exclusion? I think that should be answered by the author as well. Why they have used Western standards to exclude, and then arguing for a different Indian standard for one aspect and not for the other. So, thank you.
Yeah, no, I agree with Ananya, and I brought this up also in my presentation that it's quite strange that all the other cutoffs are Western, but only this one has to be Indian. The other thing is that Indonesia did a study to estimate the normal HB cutoff, and they found it was matching the WHO cutoff. So it's not like, personally to me, there is no biological plausibility of why there should be different HB cutoffs for people from different regions if you're adjusting for altitude. And people living in higher altitudes should have a higher hemoglobin physiologically compared to somebody who's at the sea level. So if you're adjusting for that, which happened in the WHO cutoff, they adjusted for altitude, then why should anybody have a different cutoff? Biologically, what could be the reason? If anybody has any idea, please pitch in. But I couldn't think of much. Yeah.
I had some concerns regarding the exclusion criteria. You can only, like in this paper, they have excluded for the stuff that they know and they can measure. But the population in general, there are so many other things that you cannot really measure or exclude for. So I am not sure whether the population that they called healthy is actually healthy. Like how do they control for, say, exposure to pollution or just consumption of poor quality food in general? These things cannot be really measured. But we're still not a healthy population. So I mean, even if you're saying that the bottom 5th percentile has anemia, which I mean in itself is a little strange that you have to call the bottom 5th percentile as having anemia, but there's so many things that you have still not excluded.
I agree with you. And again, these children were smaller. The CNNS data itself showed that these kids were not receiving adequate diet. So how many of those kids who were not receiving adequate diet were included in the sample size? We don't know because we don't have access to the data. How smaller were these kids? We don't know, again, because we don't have the data. So can we really call them healthy? I really doubt that. And like you mentioned, pollution is a big reason now coming up factor for anemia, because it's causing low grade inflammation, which you can argue saying that they have excluded inflammatory markers, CRP, ASAR. They have excluded those inflammatory markers. So maybe they have taken care of those things, but can you still call them normal? Is something I also highly doubt.
Another doubt I have is that what has been consistently criticized in the NFHS 5 data is the use of the instant hemoglobinometer with capillary blood readings, right? And they say that NFHS 6 say we need to exclude anemia because the method is faulty. But isn't it the responsibility of our statistical systems to come up with better measures? Like, I agree that the negative negative prediction value of the instant hemoglobinometer is quite low. But to be honest, if you look at samples that you and I, people come across in their lives, I think the prevalence would be 80% on the instant hemoglobinometer. So, yeah, I mean, what stops us from coming across with, like, a proper blood panel for our patients?
No, the problem here is that firstly that this methodology has been questioned a lot, but it's important to note that NFHS 4 to 5, the methodology didn't change. NFHS 4 was also using capillary blood. NFHS 5 is also using capillary blood. So how do you argue that your methodology is causing a rise in anemia prevalence? Second thing, there are papers showing that capillary blood can be higher and can be lower than your venous blood. So there is no consensus. There is from what I have read, there is no systematic review meta-analysis done, which is looking at which capillary reports more hemoglobin or venous reports more hemoglobin. So there's no data on that again. So these arguments are also, personally to me, are baseless. The other thing, why not have venous blood? So
Exactly.
so why not do venous blood in surveys? I have gone around with teams in the field that have done these surveys, which draw venous blood, and it's extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult on the field to convince somebody to give venous blood, and the dropout rates have been too high, and that's one reason why venous blood is a problem.
Isn't it possible to do cluster sampling within the larger populations to find the validity of the data? Like, सब पे venous नहीं करके.
Yeah, so I feel there has to be a study where you compare venous to capillary blood, and then you reach like a properly designed study, which is better, capillary or venous, and then conclude. Then take that methodology up and calculate a sample size where that venous method will give you the HB cutoff. I think that is the ideal way to go about it. But venous blood has its own sort of roadblocks in the real world setting. So which is why I feel it's quite difficult. I'm not sure how CNNS happened because they took venous sample from kids right from 1 to 19. So I'm not sure. We'll have to maybe Disha can reach out and again and ask him what roadblocks they faced, because how do you convince a mother to give venous blood from a 1-year-old who is totally normal, has no problem? So that will be interesting to find out.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the fortification of foods with iron. Like, I don't understand the basis of it being like related to anemia interventions. I mean, why would we stop fortifying foods just because it's not an effective, let's say it's not an effective measure to control iron deficiency anemia, maybe, but why are we still not fortifying? Why should we still not fortify food? Or what is the downside of it is what I want to understand.
So iron fortification has a lot of problems associated with it. Firstly, if you saw the map that I shared, the red areas, those areas are mostly tribal areas. And tribal areas we know have a high prevalence of sickle cell disease. So is anemia happening there because they have a hemoglobinopathy, they have sickle cell disease, which has high hemolysis. So if you're feeding somebody iron who has high hemolysis, they are definitely going. So there are case reports showing prolonged period of time. If you take oral iron too much, then you have iron overload, which is again harmful to causes multi-organ failure. Uh, Iron metabolism as such is quite well designed that if you don't need the iron, the body will not absorb it. So that's one argument that iron fortification doesn't harm much. But the issue that I have come across is that it also alters your gut microbiome. So it's because iron is an oxidative species, radical or whatever you want to call it, and it affects your gut microbiome. So giving that to everybody who doesn't need it, considering that we know from published and unpublished data that iron deficiency anemia prevalence is only 40%. So only 10 out of 4 or max 5 women will have iron deficiency. The rest will have something else. The cause of anemia will be something else. So firstly, you're spending more to not treat all 10 people adequately when your prevalence is only 40 to 50%. One study, the Nutrition International from Delhi has told they found the prevalence to be 30%. So that means you are spending so much and still not treating 7 people and probably causing harm to those 7 people. So which is why I feel a blanket approach, a knee-jerk reaction to anemia of giving iron to everybody is not right.
Uh, I guess that's for the day. So, thank you so much, everyone, for your active participation. Thank you, Kiran, for managing JC and taking everyone on board. Thank you, Parth. Thank you, Disha, and thank you, Madhurima, for your beautiful and critical analysis of this paper. So, as we wrap up our first gathering of the year, I want to thank you all once again for your dedication to our journal club. Let's make this year even more enriching and collaborative than the last. Once again, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. And now you can all leave the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining. Have a great weekend and happy Diwali. Bye.